Good evening. It's September 13th, 2013. I would like to welcome all of you watching to tonight's live webcast from LaRouchePAC.com featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. My name is Matthew Ogden. I will be moderating tonight's webcast. I'm also joined in the studio tonight by several members of the LaRouche Policy Committee who will be joining me to ask some of the questions as we proceed tonight. Now, before I get to the first question, I do want to make a special announcement. The brand new special report, Nuclear NWAPA 21, Gateway to the Fusion Economy, has now been printed and is available in print form. If you've not yet ordered a copy of it, please call in to our national headquarters, 1-800-929-7566. This Nuclear NWAPA 21 was assembled by members of the LaRouche Scientific Research Team, the basement team, and is the priority for everything that the LaRouche is doing. So I'm sure there will be more discussion on the contents of this special report tonight. But let me begin with the first question, which has come in from institutional circles based inside Washington, D.C., and this question is concerning the dramatic situation that we've seen playing out this week in Syria. The question is as follows. Mr. LaRouche, you have been one of the sharpest critics of the planned use of force against Syria, warning that any American military strikes could lead to thermonuclear war. Now, with the joint Russian-American initiative to turn over Syria's chemical weapons capability to United Nations supervision and eventual destruction, there is a dramatic turn. President Obama clearly had no support in Congress or from the American people for military strikes, and President Putin appears to have offered Obama a way out of the box he created for himself. Do you support the new Russian initiative on Syrian chemical weapons now being negotiated in Geneva? Do you believe that the proposed Geneva II conference under Russian-American or Russian-American-Chinese sponsorship can solve the crisis and avoid a war? And what are the added elements that you would introduce to assure the success of this effort?
Well, in general, what has happened with the appearance of the Russian president is extremely important and does make clear the options which are presented to the President of the United States, Obama, now. And should he shed those responsibilities which have been given to him, donated to him, so to speak, by the Russian president, this would cause a catastrophe for someone, possibly for the president himself, President Putin, because he's on the edge now. He's rapidly losing his credibility and losing his support. He would be unable, in my opinion, to maintain the position he held. He's using his Secretary of the State as a foil now to attempt to give him some bulwark behind him. But it won't work, because the issue here is, first of all, it's dishonest. What the president is demanding is essentially dishonest. It's a fraud. The fact that he and his Secretary of State feel that they're offended by not being appreciated the way they would like is not a good reason for, starting a third world war. And that's exactly what it is. Now, as I've said before, my inkling is that there are people in the U.S. government who would like to have the current president fall on his face on this whole issue. Because steps have been taken. If you look at these steps very closely, you would say there are people in the background who are trying to get this president to dump himself, in effect. And he's come very close to that. For example, his stumbling around from one question, one answer, one question to another, one after the other, rapid rapidity, and just impossible. So this is the situation is almost out of the hands of the president himself, of the president of the United States. And what his Secretary of State is doing isn't helping either. That's pretty kooky as well. So I think we have to look at this thing not as treating Obama as in any way something we can have confidence in that he's going to play a certain role. He can't play a certain role. He's flopping all over the place. He's like a fish out of water, just flopping around on the floor until he gets exhausted. So I don't think that Obama, while he is an issue, he's a factor in the situation. I think the thing is coming out of his control. And the danger is that other forces will take over and try to bulwark and fulfill what is being denied to this president. There's no basis in the world how the Secretary of State can rationally invite of all the law that's relevant, international law, for example. There's no basis for what he's going to do. It's a fraud. And it's just an attempted bluff. But I don't know who's sincere in the bluffing. And so therefore I wouldn't assume that there's anything good going to come out of this process from that side of the process. There are other things going on now which had to be taken into account, but this is not. This is serious in a sense because of what it implies, what could happen, what could lead to thermonuclear war. That's part of the thing. I think that danger is become less than it was in an earlier period. But this is not going to be the decision point. This issue as such is not going to be the decision point, which in my opinion is going to decide how the grand issue, the real issue, is going to turn out.
Well, the next question is concerning another dynamic that was in process simultaneously, but this one being led by the new president of China, Xi Jinping. It was reported today in the Asia Times that during the 13th annual summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the strategic organization of nations in East and Central Asia, the 13th summit was happening and is still happening in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And the new Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has made the priority discussion of this SCO summit what he calls the development of an economic belt along the Silk Road. The article describes this so-called New Silk Road as follows. It says, Beijing is already massively investing in new roads and bridges along the Eurasian Land Bridge, another denomination of the New Silk Road. As Asia Times Online has reported, the New Silk Road is all about highways, railways, fiber optics, and pipelines, with now the added Chinese push for logistics centers, manufacturing hubs, and inevitably new cities and townships. Now, the question concerning this is as follows. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is meeting today in Bishkek. According to initial news accounts, Chinese President Xi Jinping has come into the meeting with an elaborate proposal for a new Silk Road, also referred to as the Eurasian Land Bridge. This initiative, which came originally from you and your wife, Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, back in the early 1980s, would establish development corridors running from the Pacific Far East into the Atlantic coast of Europe. How do you view this Xi Jinping initiative? What do you and your basement team propose to add to this welcome Chinese initiative?
Well, first of all, since Helge was the architect of the policy for the New Silk Road originally, in my opinion too, it's not just her opinion, it's also mine. And on that we stand. But the problem is that there's something else has to be added, that this is not adequate. Because to build the New Silk Road, you have to have a growing economy which provides the means for doing it. Now that is something we're working on now. We are committed in the basement and in other ways. We are committed to a commitment to a development of a new form of organization of the Trans-Pacific region. From the Mississippi River deep into China, going by way of the Bering Straits. What we need is a thermonuclear fusion driver as the power driver for a system which will include the NWOPA system as a design, but in a modern thermonuclear approaching version. But again, in addition to this, a specific thermonuclear fusion program as a power driver of the level which is absolutely required to do the things which have to be done now. Remember, China is on the edge of a collapse, not caused by China, but caused by the transatlantic region. The transatlantic region is collapsing. Europe is collapsing. It's on the threat of disintegration. The United States could similarly go into a disintegration mode because of the stupid policies of the European states and of the United States under its recent presidents. So therefore, the question is, can we solve the danger of a general collapse coming out of the transatlantic region and spilling over to destroy what China has been accomplishing on its own account so far? So therefore, the Silk Road program, the Asian Silk Road, is necessary. But the question, we need the level of power in order to, one of the things we have to handle here is water requirements. Now you have to process a lot of water. And to process that water, you've got to have a system which can handle it. And that's peaceful thermonuclear power. So peaceful thermonuclear power is the thing that's absolutely indispensable if any of these programs for China and other parts of the world are to be accomplished. In other words, this is an absolute necessity. Now, the question is, when will the thermonuclear power be brought into play? Well, it doesn't have to be brought into play right away, because we've got to do some other things right away. We've got to change some policies right away, scrap things that should be scrapped, get rid of this green policy which is killing us. The United States will never recover, again, as a nation, if the green policy is not killed out. That's the end of things. So the important thing is this policy which we put on the table. We put it on the table on the basis of having discussions with relevant people. I was familiar with the thermonuclear fusion problem a long time ago, about 40 years ago. But that's not new to me. But the time has come when it should be generally acceptable to install a thermonuclear policy, that is, as a driver. This would mean it means, first of all, saving the United States, saving the water system of the United States. We have, from the Mississippi to the Pacific, we have a breakdown crisis of the economy. Forget the streets, forget all the other things. We have a breakdown crisis from the Mississippi River across up to the way of north, by way of the Bering Straits, and across into China, across the Pacific Ocean. And that driver is what we need as something we can promise to do, which will make it possible for us to do what we have to do in that region. If we do this for the Trans-Pacific region, that is from the Mississippi River eastward into around the most of Asia, if we do that, we will have created the instrument which is sufficient to deal with the planetary problems which are going to affect us in the coming decades. And we must start now, because to build this system which we require is going to take a dozen or more years even to get it started. We have to build the NWAPA system in this new form. That's number one. We have to do the same thing in Asia with similar kinds of programs. They need China requires a thermonuclear program of this type. Japan requires also participation in the same thing. The parts of Siberia absolutely require it. And Alaska absolutely requires it. So these are things that have to come. They're going to come on the basis of the planning board, on the basis of commitments. And it's going to be a miracle of working with the credit system, the American credit system, because we do not have the means right now to pay up to the point required. We do not have the resources now to do really complete a thermonuclear fusion operation, trans-Pacific. But if we commit ourselves to that and commit the credit resources required to that, we can, within, say, a decade or 20 years, we can complete this kind of project.
Let me just expand on this a little bit on the international front before we get back to questions from the policy committee here. But just because you brought up certain aspects of this, this is a question which came in today from Lawrence Freeman, who is the Africa desk editor for EIR magazine. And this is concerning Africa. His question is, in recent weeks, I have spoken to citizens and representatives of sub-Saharan nations about the need for Glass-Steagall, a new Hamiltonian credit system, and the urgency for building great infrastructure projects in Africa. There's a growing recognition among Africans that the economies of Western nations are in a severe crisis, which has accompanied a decrease in investment in Africa, with many turning towards China. They agreed with your approach on infrastructure, but say their problem is how to fund these projects. They recount that there has been a discussion of infrastructure projects in Africa since Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, in the 1960s, the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, and more recently, plans for region-wide infrastructure in southern Africa by the SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community. Though prior to meeting us, they were unaware of projects like Transaqua and the Africa Pass. But they say that the IMF and World Bank and Western nations will not fund these projects, and only China has made investments in this area. The question they ask is how many, or how do they, as African nations, provide the credit for these projects? Does each nation establish its own national bank? Do they pool their resources? Do they seek money from other countries? Given your expertise, they would like to know what course of action you recommend.
Well, first of all, when you talk about Africa, you're talking about a region of the planet in which the determination has been, for as long as I can think back, to genocide. The policy toward Africa by the British Empire, by the Dutch branch of the same empire. These people have said Africans are not to survive. They are to be slaves, or the tantamount to slaves, and not to survive. So that it's not a problem that somebody has a difficulty in dealing with. The problem is what is being created as the problem by the British Empire. Because the British Empire, which also has a large Dutch component, and as a matter of fact, the British Empire was created by the Dutch system. And you had the Dutch tyrants went over into England, made a big mess of England and the Scottish and the Irish and so forth, and they brought the Dutch Empire into the British monarchy. So that there is no such thing as a British monarchy, there is an Anglo-Dutch monarchy, and it's primarily Dutch. And this is the source of the evil which we're dealing with. It's the Anglo-Dutch system, which dominates up to 60% of the total world population's economy. So the problem is you cannot solve this problem by getting credit in there, because the Anglo-Dutch system, as long as it's in charge, will not let it happen. What you're talking about in Africa, you're talking about controlled and uncontrolled genocide. That's what you're talking about. You're not talking about a financial problem. You're talking about a moral problem. And these characters are immoral. Now, sure, I mean, you take Africans and put through this situation, you don't expect them to behave like nice people do. They have no chance to do that. They're not given that chance. They're denied it. Maybe a few people who are wealthier or more advantageous can survive in this African system. But in general, it is a crime. It is not a system, it's a crime. And we have to actually, the only way you're going to get Africa's problem solved is by getting rid of the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. That's the only way you will ever get it, or by bloodshed of some other form. And that's the problem. And there are no mealy-mouthed explanations. This is genocide. It's controlled genocide. They control the genocide as an ongoing process, maintain the population in absolute misery, stir up all kinds of warfare among the Africans themselves, make all kinds of these little disturbances. And thus they control the territory. And it is the British Anglo-Dutch system, like the Dutch in South Africa, the Anglo-Dutch system, which controls this process. And what we have to do is we have to shut down the Anglo-Dutch system. Now, that's not an option for us. That's a necessity. Because if we don't do it, now nothing is going to work.
Okay. I would like to ask Bill Roberts, a member of the Policy Committee, to come to the podium to pose a question.
Okay. So, as Matt indicated, there's clearly a certain direction of leadership coming from the new Chinese president, at least an intention to change and to shift much more with respect to a certain concept of Eurasian development. And this obviously has certain implications for us here, for the United States, in terms of collaboration on nuclear, on space, orientation toward space program development. Now, on this side of the Pacific, this week in particular, recently, the post-9/11 paradigm has been challenged by Obama being forced to step back from a war that not only could have led to World War III, thermonuclear war, but which was also unconstitutional and illegal from the standpoint of international law. Now, I think this has certain implications. One, in the sense that there was, I think, a certain type of recognition that Obama has been asking for impeachment. And even we noticed in discussions with certain congressmen, particularly Democrats, there was a certain recognition of the fact, a sort of spilling of the beans by John Kerry of where the hell this war was even coming from in the first place. That is, if it's so unpopular for the American people, if it was unpopular in both parties to such a degree that it was actually bringing people together from either side of the aisle, where was this actually coming from? And the question when John Kerry said that if we do go to boots on the ground, don't worry about the cost because the Saudis will pay for it. And it's sort of, in a lot of people's minds, what we've been getting out, and the calls by Walter Jones to have the 28 pages of the 9/11 report, which specifically go through the Saudi role in 9/11. I mean, it really just sort of brought, I think, in certain people's minds, a clarity to this idea of what Obama is and what we're really up against here. So I'm just thinking, in a certain type of way, the defeat of this imperial faction, at least in this type of way, and the collapse of Obama's presidency does signal a certain potential for international collaboration. And I'll just say, the question I have specifically is, what in this global context is the role of the policy committee? And I'll just say parenthetically, in certain meetings this week with staffers, I realized in discussion with one staffer that saying that we haven't had progress since the assassination of John F. Kennedy meant absolutely nothing to the staffer, because they were so young and they just didn't have a frame of reference for the idea of progress.
Well, the only way you can really competently answer that proposed question is to look back a little bit and see what went wrong inside the United States. Now, what had happened is you had two phases of a problem. Franklin Roosevelt had died. He had died while in office because the British, in particular, and others, had postponed the invasion of continental Europe by various ruses over a period of more than a year. And the purpose of this was to take a president who was sick, ill, mortally ill, work him to death, and keep him on the job in order to try to save the mission to which he was committed. As a result, thus, this postponement brought the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And after that, Truman came in. And Truman was, frankly, a skunk, a real skunk, who was a tool of the British monarchy, in particular. Winston Churchill, who is the tool of the British monarchy at that point. And these forces then, by bringing this creep, Truman, into the presidency, the policy of the presidency was changed dramatically, virtually in direct opposition to everything that he had stood for. So, I just spent something here. So that's the nature of the problem. And when we look at these kinds of things, we have to understand that. We have a skunk hollow in our presidency. It's still there. It's been there ever since the death of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy policy was everything we want. Practically everything we want was being done by John F. Kennedy. The minute he was dead and shot dead, the right wing took over. And they never stopped taking over. There were presidents who were not right wing of that type, but the whole system was saturated increasingly with this right wing turn. So it was the same kind of thing that Truman had represented, a right wing turn which was permanent, which had a moment there with the new president coming in who didn't really deal with the full job because he was not in position to do so. But what happened with John F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy launched the kind of job that Roosevelt had intended. As a matter of fact, he was working with Eleanor Roosevelt at his back on this one. So therefore, what happened is we have never had, in the history of the United States, we have never had a net growth, economic growth in the United States. We've been wearing things down. We had some things that were growth, but they were small packages relative to the total picture. So the point is, that's the thing we have to deal with. We have to eliminate that heritage. The heritage of Truman, the heritage of the skunks that came in later. Of people who were not skunks, but they were just cowardly. For example, you had the case of Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was not a skunk. He was a very honest man. But he wasn't courageous enough, as he himself said. I can see those 3 rifles pointed at my head if I don't give in to them. And he went and declared a war in Indochina, which went on for a decade. And the United States never recovered from that interval. Yes, we did the good things. A number of us did good things. But it wasn't enough to compensate for what was bad. And the problem here now is not an economic problem as such. It is an economic problem in effect. But the problem is not economic in source. It's economic in effect, in political effect. Because at any time in this time, if we had a presidency which would stand up to what was obviously needed, a presidency which would simply pick up the standard of what John F. Kennedy had been doing, we would never have had any of this mess. And the mess started immediately under Truman on the question of dealing with the Soviet Union and similar kinds of things. So nothing worked, and nothing really has worked. The United States has been going downhill. When you look at the totality of the effects, downhill ever since John F. Kennedy's assassination. And that's what you have to understand. And when you face that reality, and don't try to make excuses or explanations which somehow would be palliatives in this situation. They don't exist. And sometimes you have to bite the bullet. And this is one of those times.
Okay, next I would like to ask Dave Christie to come to the podium.
Okay, so Lynn, I have a question on, really to pose it in the context of this new Silk Road idea, which is of course not a new idea for you in terms of fighting for it, but in terms of a viable proposal, and frankly what was just put forward I think is exciting in its prospects if developed in the way that it needs to be developed. And what's come to my mind is that much of how we've dealt with the global community is really under globalization, and properly stated is it's not globalization, or it's the British Empire. It's the rule of a global financier syndicate with its multinational cartels and so forth. And much of how nations have identified has either been in submission to the empire or in reaction to the empire. Even such things as protectionist measures are against the empire. Now, we're at a point now where this empire is crumbling, and a new set of relationships has to be put on the table. And so I guess in one sense I'd like to ask the question around not just the Silk Road wasn't just simply trade. You had cultural exchanges. You had with that comes an increasing education for people. And if you look at what's going on right now, this is on the table. And in terms of issues around technology sharing, I'd like to ask you just on that, but I was just thinking of this from the standpoint of, our universities right now. If you go to the science and engineering departments, you can often feel like you're in China, and then you go try to find the blue collar worker in the United States, and they're actually in China because that's where some of the work is. It's a slight exaggeration, but and so the question is, as we enter this new phase of mankind, without the British Empire, without the globalization model, how do you deal with issues around technology sharing, issues around, in the United States we have these national labs, we have a sort of an advanced capability that way, but they're not being utilized by our own citizens in one sense. So you've made the point that we're not going to bring back the auto industry to the United States as it once was. Let Asia have it. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do you deal with technology sharing in terms of where we have industries within a world that's now going to be cooperating, freed from the grip of the British Empire?
Well, there are many aspects of this thing, but essentially we're going into a new period now, and particularly our own role in this business, to the extent we have much influence, is going to change. The way everything is done is going to change. The question, we do have a certain ability to exercise influence. For example, we've seen that in the campaigns which our organization has been running in recent periods. You had, on one bright day in San Francisco and Los Angeles, you had the thieves of Wall Street discovered that we existed. And they were not happy because they discovered that we were challenging their ability to control the U.S. economy. And they were frightened. They were scared. And they acted that way. They were terrified. They hide. They try to deny things. They are fools. And they are all also genuinely bankrupt. And they're looking for a scheme which is a fraud. There's no truth in their assets. But they are scared. Now, what that means is this. If we defeat this Obama and what that ties to, and Wall Street, politically, then we're not going to have a Wall Street problem. Why? Because Glass-Steagall will be enacted. And we have to be sure that, and make sure that it is enacted. Because once it's enacted, what will happen is this very simple procedure. You take all these fraudulent banking accounts on Wall Street, internationally and otherwise. They have no honest value. They have no real value at all. It's like this whole thing of this printing of money in the United States. It's a swindle. There's no value there. Bail out and bail in are nothing but absolute swindles. If you had an honest banking system, which has been taken away from us by these guys, we wouldn't have that problem. And if we do the right thing and we get Glass-Steagall through, the first thing we're going to do is call these guys in to their little offices and make them account for what that money is they claim that they own, what value. Because I can tell you they have no value. What they've done is they've taken paper money, inflation money, pure speculation, and this is what's called the wealth of Wall Street. And Wall Street is saying, we've got to protect our interests. Well, they have no legitimate interest to speak of. If you put them to a real inquiry of what is their real honest earnings, you would find they're tiny. Most of them, their net earnings would be negative. The whole system would generally collapse. And we wouldn't save them. We don't owe anything to them. We owe to the banks which are real banks, and people who can do real banking. We need their role. but we don't need them. We're just going to have to wipe that big inflation off the books. If you take the Wall Street debt, the fake part, the clearly fake part of the Wall Street debt, or what their claims are, their assets, and you say, what's it worth? It's worth less than nothing. And maybe some of those types of banks might have a tiny margin of something left of what they claim to have represented. So we're going to have to reorganize the system, which means that legitimate banking will be protected by aid of the federal government's backing. We will have a system of credit, which we use through the government in order to rebuild functioning farms and other things that are needed. So we will give credit to that purpose, but under supervision. The federal government will call on its own assets to provide backing for these projects, just exactly as Alexander Hamilton prescribed. And that the Alexander Hamilton system is the actual system of of our system. So in that case, we're starting with a completely different system, which we are creating, and it's the will of the people expressed in the Congress and elsewhere, the will of the people to have such a reform. And we can start rebuilding on the day that act is put in place. That is really the only solution, because as long as you're trying to carry a great mass of worthless money and treating it as if it were real, this nation cannot survive. So it's not a question of Wall Street's rights. Wall Street has no net rights. There may be people on Wall Street who can show something that they do have an honest asset. But the Wall Street system, the British system, has no rights anymore. It's a piece of thievery. It's bankrupt. And if you try to support it, you're going to kill yourself. So we're in that situation now where we're coming up to the point that the real decision that has to be made is an Alexander Hamilton decision. To go back to the system which was created by our Constitution and to restore its functioning immediately. Glass-Steagall's reenactment will give us the basis for doing so. And once these powerful, so-called powerful banks, Steve banks, once they're tamed, you're going to find that people are going to find their courage again. And they're going to quickly jump in there to clean up the mess. It's only the power, the international power of the international banking system, the financial system, that enables them to control this process and steal everything worthwhile from the people of the United States. So all these things are really political. We're living in a universe, this planet, we're living in these conditions which are controlled by imperial forces. You cannot say that there's less than 40% of the total wealth of the planet is controlled by the Anglo-Dutch Empire. That's what the problem is. And these guys are thieves. Now, that's the problem. And if we have the guts, we'll take our nation back. And Glass-Steagall will be the sufficient basis for doing so. These guys, the Sharpies, now most of the people who are in Wall Street don't know or don't want to know what the problem is. Most of them, probably by the end of this year, Wall Street will go bankrupt. What they will do is some of them will take their money and run to hide and leave the rest of the people, the suckers, who are now the Wall Street crowd, the mass of the Wall Street crowd, is going down the tube, probably before the end of this year. Because there's no possible way we can sustain this bubble. It's all it is a bubble. So the question is, you have to change the question in order to get the answer. Because what are you going to do? And that changes the question. If you're going to shut down Wall Street, by a very simple means of first calling in Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall then means when that action has occurred, then the banking system, the legitimate banking system, and the U.S. government combined are going to rush in to rehabilitate our national system. And it will be done very simply, in the method characteristics of our original Constitution. We'll shut down what's fake, what's fraudulent. We will probably penalize some of the people who committed crimes. That's not the most important thing. And we're going to restart with large projects based on a credit system, a federal credit system. We're going to rebuild this economy and start it right from the go. Then what we can imagine we should do, what we select as policies, will not be difficult for us to determine. And most people, once you've got the enemy out of the way, once you've got the scarecrow out of the way, Wall Street, the scarecrow, once they're gone, out of the way, and you can make, as citizens, you can make your own decisions, this sideshow is going to come to an end.
Okay, let me next ask Michael Steger to come to the podium.
Thank you. Lynn, since the drive for an attack on Syria has begun aggressively, and given our current president's affinity towards Hitler-like policies, there has been a growing sense of a crisis in international law that has brought the doctrine of right to protect and other justifications against the principle of sovereignty to become clearly out in the open. And this has been discussed publicly in Washington, D.C. over the course of the last week. The question I have for you is, to what extent will the passage of Glass-Steagall and the adoption of a Hamilton credit system in the United States affect the questions of international law?
It will not be a problem. It just won't be a problem, because there are a lot of people out there who agree with what I say. They're just afraid to say it themselves. And once you give these guys a stroke of that type, they're going to run. You look at the way that in California, when these California crats out there discovered that I was the source of the threat to their existence of their system, you got an idea of what's going on. And I am a threat to the system. I intend to be a threat to the system, because the system is a fraud. It's a crooked fraud. It's an international fraud which happens to pick the destruction of our nation as one of its features. And we're just going to act nothing nasty. We're just going to reenact our original Constitution and its appendages, the policies we had before, policies such as those of Franklin Roosevelt. And that's all we're going to do. And that's all we don't, with our Constitution, we don't need fancy kinds of special gimmicks of the type like the Detroit raids are. We don't need swindles. Under our Constitution, if it's applied effectively with insight, we can deal with all of our problems to the extent they can be dealt with at all. We don't need these swindles. And that's the key to this whole business. The problem is that we have people who are ignorant and cowardly when it comes to major political issues. They're afraid. They're frightened. Look what you've had. Look at what we've had as presidents in this period. Some of them weren't so bad personally, but the system was horrible. From the moment that Jack Kennedy was killed, nothing worked right, and never did, really. Some people did a few useful things, but overall, the overall tendency, the net effect, from the time that Jack Kennedy was killed until the present time, there has never been net progress in the United States, not economic progress. Never. And once you get that idea clearly in your head, and you're not afraid to deny it, then things go much better. And what it takes is someone has to be tough. But the key thing here is we have something we're looking for. We're looking for what? Nuclear fusion. Thermonuclear fusion. Without that instrument, as in the Pacific region and so forth, without that instrument, you cannot really save civilization as it is today. So it's the positive things that we have the insight and courage to put forward. That is what we must base ourselves on. You can't trust anything else, either because it's a lie or because it's hopelessly inadequate. And we've gone through this carefully. Thermonuclear fusion is the instrument which is needed as coming online in order to give us a new economy of the planet. And that can be done.
So we're going to take just two more questions. I think I would like to ask Keisha Rogers to pose the next question.
Hello. That was a great segue into what I was thinking as a question, which is thinking in the future. I'm optimistic about where we are already envisioning a world without Obama, because we already see Obama right now plunging very rapidly into the world of no return, along with his cronies such as John Kerry and others. And we can really start looking at the world without a green environmentalist genocidal agenda. We can look at a world already being shaped that is devoid of a British Empire. So now that we have all of that out of the way, we can actually start to prepare ourselves for what the future must look like and what the world is already ready for. And I can really say that the world is ready for the type of scientific progress that the basement has just laid out, our scientific research team, in their new report on the nuclear NWAPA and the fusion economy. And one thing that comes to mind is the scientific community being organized. What this actually prepares the scientific community to be organized around a unified mission orientation that we really haven't had since the Manhattan Project, since the death of President Franklin Roosevelt. You actually saw certain remnants of it in the Kennedy administration with the Apollo mission. But we have some very pertinent questions to answer concerning the nature of mankind and concerning what is essential for the progress of humanity. Things that have come up, such as how do we deal with space weather? How do we deal with asteroids hitting the planet? Asteroid defense. How do we deal with new questions that are being posed right now, such as the potential or the threat of not global warming, but global cooling? All of these things are pertinent for the progress and the sustaining of human life and life in general on the planet. And so, therefore, our NWAPA fusion economy does not just take up a question for what is essential here on Earth, but I would say all of these projects, all of these questions are centered around one fundamental question, which is the need to have a unified scientific mission. And this is what this does. So I would like to ask you, how would you propose the reestablishment of a new brain trust in our scientific community to once again, not just in the scientific community, but a national, a global brain trust that would actually unify these scientific questions as the necessary driver for human progress, given what we have just put out in our thermonuclear NWAPA pamphlet? Well,
this pamphlet has a implicit hovering sequel is not something we have actually presented as such, but it's something which is there. First of all, there's some people talk about putting the man on Mars. I have no plan for putting a man on Mars. What we have is we have equipment which we can either have built for there or can build there. And it takes a lot of time, getting back and forth from Mars and Earth. I mean, you can't always do that every day. There are only certain times of the year that you can do that. But we can actually improve that, and we can use Mars as part of a system which we need. For example, let's take the case of these asteroids. Now, there are millions of asteroids out there. In terms of solar system terms, they're there in a convenient nearby neighborhood. Now, one of these larger asteroids were to hit the planet Earth would extinguish the human population of Earth. And therefore, the question is posed, how are we going to defend Earth? And what is the implication of facing this problem? What does that mean for us in terms of policy today, policy overall? Well, it means we've got to have some ways to run some interference against dangerous asteroids. That's just one of the problems. Now, some people talk about putting a woman on Mars. Well, I talked about that thing some decades ago, and it was a rather popular thing that I produced in that connection. But I never really intended to concentrate on Mars as a habitation, because I was somewhat aware of what the weather was up there, and that was not exactly conducive. It might be made to something that we can use in that way, but the primary thing is, what is the immediate purpose of being on Mars? There are many contingent things which are useful, many reasons why you would want to investigate what's going up there, just on the basis of science alone. But the real issue is, can we create, within this section of the solar system, can we create an effective defense against deadly asteroids? Now, the question is not, can we do that? That's not a question. We can do that. Or we could, if we approach it in the right way. But the issue is, how do we see mankind? Do we see mankind as a little old hole down there someplace, which people are gathered in? Or do we see man on Earth as having a higher significance within the solar system? What does the existence of Earth do for the solar system, the immediate part of the solar system, such as the range between Mars and Earth, for example, which is one of the asteroid zones? There are other things that are also threats out there. So therefore, we must be concerned. If we're concerned with anything at all, we should be concerned about the survival of the human species. Isn't that an important thing for people on Earth? Do we want to defend the existence of the human species? Or do we think it's not worth the time? That's the question. Now, this is but what I'm saying is true. There's no exaggeration. That's the situation. When this might happen or how it might happen exactly, we don't know. But we do know this danger exists. And therefore, when we're talking about the interests of the United States, we have to be talking about the interests of Earth, too, because Earth is the United States is located in Earth. So we have to be concerned about that, too. Therefore, we have to think about the defense of the planet Earth, and especially the people on it, from these very palpable threats which exist in the form of large asteroids. One of those hits the Earth, that's it. Now, the idea of defending Earth against the asteroid is not really an impossible thing. It's a difficult problem. But it requires a lot of engineering and a lot of science to go with it. But we're going to have to do that. If you're not going to do that, if your government is not going to do that, if other governments are not going to do that, they're not worth anything. If they're not going to defend the human species on Earth, And from those kinds of threats, they're not serious. It doesn't make any difference when the threat might occur, how it might occur, or what Sunday or what Tuesday. It is not important. The important is the threat exists, and we have presently no adequate means of defeating such an asteroid attack. Therefore, the problem here is not the asteroid issue as such, but the asteroid issue exemplifies something. That most people running around the streets of the United States and other parts of the world ain't paying much attention at all to the survival of the human species. Because they're not taking a question like the asteroid threat, which is known to be real and known to be a threat, and we're not doing anything about it. And there are other things, beside the asteroid threat, which are also problems which are existential in their nature. And therefore we've got to stop thinking small. We've got to think larger. You don't have to go to Jupiter. We have to deal with that later. But that's not our concern. We're concerned about the immediate vicinity of Earth. And we're thinking about Mars and Earth, and we're thinking about swarms of asteroids up there, large and small, fast and slow. And we know that some of them are going to hit around here. So many have hit before. Often they were little tiny things. Or mostly the moon got the bad treatment. You look at the moon, you know the face of the moon, you know a very, very terrible situation there. So that's where the problem lies. We are not sufficiently concerned with the human species. We're not even trying to understand what the role of the human species is in the solar system. We don't know what our mission is as a species. And you can't even handle an outhouse the way these things run these days. So that's, I think, is a key issue, is that you have an attitude problem, a magnet, really a major one. That people will squawk about things, they'll talk about things, they'll complain about things, but they don't have a repertoire which includes all of the things which should be of relatively leading concern. And certainly a large asteroid hitting Earth ought to be one of the highest ranks of concern. And if you're not thinking about doing something about that or preparing to do something about that, you ain't much of a citizen.
All right, and we have one more final question, and this is going to be presented by Rachel Brown.
Hello, Lynn. I would also just like to make the point on the Glass-Steagall fight that you brought up, that the fight for Glass-Steagall has not gone away. There was several events, including a desperate one today featuring Barney Frank speaking not very frankly on why Glass-Steagall had nothing to do with anything, and Glass was smarter than Steagall, and some more things that were not worth mentioning. But now I would like to pose the question that came up in some events recently, which was the counter to what we're putting forward, which often comes in the form of the idea of the needs of the human individual, and that human society is really just organized around individual greed. And I'd just like to counter that with the idea of Vladimir Vernadsky and see what you think and have to say about it. As this great scientist Vladimir Vernadsky introduced himself a new idea into human thought, that human thought itself is a geological force, and that the human species shapes the flow and activity of material in the Earth's crust through farming, directing water, directing material, mining, developing new materials themselves. So this is essentially an evolving process, and one in which the individual has a role, but there's a larger process that defines the human species as a whole. So I just wanted you to discuss this relationship of the real role of the individual in human society.
Well, you have some things are called natural events. And there are some things which are not simply natural events. And we find that the role of the human species, the human individual, is one of the great forces that controls the destiny of Earth and of Earth itself. Well, what's understood, what Vernadsky understood more and more as he went through, is to recognize this idea that the man himself is a geological force, among other things, other forces. And therefore, we have to think in terms of how are we going to organize the planet and the vicinity of the planet as a force. Are we going to control that force by making contributions of human ingenuity which intervene on our behalf implicitly? And that was the great achievement of him, the great moral achievement of him, was that. And we think of ourselves as people traveling on the surface of the planet, something like that. And it's nonsense, because you have to say mankind has demonstrated mankind to be one of the greatest forces on this planet. We are not little people individually running around with funny ideas. We are people who are actually mastering the control of the full power of this planet, which is exercised in many ways, by multiple ways. Everything that happens also has a cause, and we have the volitional characteristic of of Earth. Volitional because it all comes from living creatures. And the most powerful force of all, which determines what kinds of living creatures can exist on Earth, is man himself. The mind, the creative mind of the human individual himself. We think of things like real estate. Yeah, real estate is a reality in a sense, but it's not that important in that way. What's important is the volitional characteristics of processes of nature, and especially above all else, the increasing ratio of role of the human species in determining the destiny of this planet itself and beyond. And once you have that attitude and understand what reality is, finally discover what reality is. It is not what your neighbor's opinion is. It's not what the typical politician opinion is. It's not really a real force in history. You have some people who have, in the Congress too, who have real ideas, real insight, real commitment to important conceptions. They do that. But when it comes to politics, most people are just slobs. Only a few people are really serious about this matter. We're living on a planet. This planet is in the solar system. It's a dangerous place to live, but the best place we got. So we want to protect this planet. But we also are going to worry about the neighboring planets and what effect they have on us, and what the effect of the processes of the solar system as a whole, what that means. Ultimately, these things are the issues that come to us. And as soon as we have the information and instinct and capability to do something about these things which are in the human means of human capability, we are now responsible to try to figure out how to do the job. And that's the way this has to be seen. I mean, he was very clear on this thing about understanding the relationship between the human mind and human thought, and what determines things physically on the universe, in the Earth and the universe. And that attitude, represents the kind of attitude which distinguishes real leaders in science and other respects, as opposed to people who are just trying to make a living.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, members of the policy committee. I would say again, the new special report is available in print form, and you can contact us either through the website or you can call in 1-800-929-7566 and get a copy. So that brings a conclusion to our webcast tonight, and I thank you for joining us. Good night, and stay tuned.